In ancient Israel, in the Hebrew scriptures, what we sometimes call the Old Testament, the relationship between God and the people of Israel, the Israelites, was really, really formally connected by what was called a covenant relationship. There are these very clear, spelled out promises. I will be your God, you will be my people, fleshed out in commandments and laws and promises. God would do these things, the people would do these things. Sometimes the prophets or the writers in the Old Testament would talk about that covenant, that formal relationship, almost like a treaty between nations or a lord and a servant. Sometimes it was more like a deal or what we might call a contract. Sometimes, though, in fact, quite often, the biblical writers talked about that covenant relationship between God and the people like a marriage, as though God and the people of Israel were married to one another in promises of steadfast love. Well, that works as long as that relationship is working, but what would happen if that marriage came to an end? That's where our conversation begins this coming week as we take a look at one more example of when God breaks the rules. So far in this series, we've taken a look at other examples of where a character, a figure in a biblical story seems to suggest God breaking rules, commandments, or customs that were a part of the world in which the Bible was written. We talked earlier about God overturning the cultural norm of putting the firstborn in the position of most importance, how God overturned that social custom or rule by choosing secondborns and thirdborns and overturning the lesser over the greater in all sorts of different ways. We talked last time about the clear commandment in the Torah about no Moabites being allowed among the people of God, and then the story of Ruth where a Moabite is not only included but turns out to be the example of God's kind of steadfast covenant love. So this week we're going to take a look at another passage of Scripture that in some ways is even bigger a deal. Here's the scene. As I mentioned, often in ancient Israel, the relationship between God and the people is described in terms of like a marriage, right? That the covenant between God and the people is not just a deal or a contract, but more like a marriage, right? And of course, there are terms in a marriage. As long as you are faithful, you can work through an awful lot of conflicts. But of course, what if there's repeated infidelity? What if over and over and over again the people turn away from the God they've promised to be faithful to? Well, that's sort of the situation by the time you get the prophet Jeremiah coming on the scene. Jeremiah and other prophets like him take a look at the ways that his own people have turned away from God and chased after foreign alliances or the empire on the stage at the time or other gods or their wealth or their military strength, often chasing after all those things, despite the fact that prophets keep calling them back. No, you're supposed to live the covenant way of life. No, we're supposed to be faithful to God. We're not supposed to give our hearts or our love or our allegiance to other nations and alliances with them, or put our trust in our military power or our wealth or their gods. Any of those things are like cheating on God, like being unfaithful in a marriage. So that's pretty standard language for the prophets. By the time you get to Jeremiah writing, though, Jeremiah seems to be saying, we're at the end of this relationship. The people have been so unfaithful over and over and over again, despite God calling them back to faithfulness. It's like the relationship is over. After all, God had warned back all the way back in the storytelling of Deuteronomy, if there comes a point that the people persist in turning away from God for too long, God will end this relationship and you'll be carried away into exile. So when Jeremiah speaks, that's where they're at. Exile is on the horizon. It is right there. And basically, Jeremiah says, we're at the end of this marriage relationship between us and God. Okay, So that sounds kind of hopeless, right? Especially when you know that in ancient Israel, there are rules that forbid, if you have been divorced, from remarrying that same spouse you were married to. There were some rules that allowed for divorce. In fact, there's a famous scene in the New Testament where Jesus is asked about his opinion on divorce, and in the subject, in the discussion, comes up this mention that Moses had allowed that you could write a certificate of divorce and end a marriage. But one thing that was not allowed, absolutely not allowed, as part of ancient Israel's tradition, was if you divorced somebody, you couldn't take them back and remarry them again. And the idea was that you don't treat anybody like a yo-yo. You can't say, we're on today, we're broken up tomorrow, we're on today, we're broken up again tomorrow. That's not fair to people. You have to let people, if they're going to be married, they need to be married. And if they're not going to be married, that's it, relationship over. But we don't do this back and forth so that we don't treat people like they are disposable. It's probably a really, really sound idea. How do we make sure that nobody just casually throws somebody else away? Well, you say, if we can't work this out and this is over, then it's really over. But there's no going back. So you got to be really, really sure that this relationship is done, right? So knowing that in the background of ancient Israel's memory is this really, really clear commandment that if a marriage ends, you can't take that person back. So Jeremiah 3 opens with this sort of thought experiment with the people listening. And he says, wouldn't it be awful if you lived in a land where people who had divorced their spouses, like, tried to marry them again? Wouldn't that be awful? Wouldn't a land where that happened be terrible? I mean, think about how awful, how disgusting it would be if people were married today, divorced tomorrow, remarried to the same people again. How chaotic, how rotten that would be. What a terrible society that would be if you tried to make it work and you decided together, we can't make it work, we need to go our separate ways, and then you try and take the person back the next day. That's treating somebody like a yo-yo. You can't do that. That would just be terrible, Jeremiah says. And it seems like, yeah, that's right. He's got the sense that his audience would be listening along going, yeah, that would be terrible. Oh, what a terrible, sinful, wicked land that would be if you had that happening all the time. So then comes the twist. Jeremiah says to the people, well, what's God going to do? After all, we were in a covenant relationship with God, and we broke that relationship. We ended that relationship in what you might call a covenant divorce, what you might call an end of the relationship, a parting of the ways. The rules should say God's not allowed to take us back. The rules should say God's not allowed to re-enter into covenant relationship with us. The rules say God's not allowed. And then Jeremiah does something amazing, something wonderful. Jeremiah moves on and says, I know what the rules are. God is well aware of what the rules are. There may even be good reasons for the commandments that forbid remarrying somebody you divorced from. But then Jeremiah says, but God chooses to re-enter into relationship with us anyway. Anyway, even though there's good reasons why God should say no, even though the people have not done a thing to prove themselves that it'll be different this time, God reserves the right to start over again, even to renew the old covenant relationship. So later on, you'll hear from Jeremiah and other prophets the idea that what comes out of the exile is a whole new covenant, a whole new relationship. Christians, of course, see that coming to fulfillment in Jesus, but not to get ahead of ourselves. What starts all that out is basically God saying, I know there's a rule saying I'm not allowed to take you back, and I'll take you back anyway. Isn't God aware it was God's rule in the first place that you can't take somebody back? Yeah, God's aware. And yet, once again, God decides, God reserves the right to choose to go beyond what the rules say, in order to show mercy to people, in order to be gracious, in order to be good, even though they're stinkers who might not deserve it. God reserves the right to be merciful. God reserves the right to take them back. That's where our conversation is going this coming Thursday, as we have another conversation in our 10-week series, When God Breaks the Rules, and take a look at why it's really good news that God reserves the right to go beyond what the restrictions of the rules say. Hope you can join us on Thursday at 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ. If you can't catch up with us with these video session summaries, we hope we'll see you along the way.